Welcome back to the show. Most people are taught that history is a straight line, but in the American South, history is a series of erasures. We're told the story of African slavery, and we're told the story of the Trail of Tears. But there's a missing chapter, a chapter about the dark skinned warriors who fought the Spanish and the British long before the word Seminole was even a household name. These weren't runaways. They were the original owners of the land, of the soil, captured as prisoners of war and sold into the system designed to strip them of their names. Today, we're tearing up the colonial script and looking at the paper genocide of the Florida tribes. Stick with me.
Get into some historical records that clarify the primary outcome for the Seminole people. Those that were not forced to Oklahoma ended up being in mass enslavement, but not all of them. So we had the Oklahoma Trail of Tears, we had the enslavement of South Carolina and other southern states, as well as those that hid in the valleys and the mountains and other land masses and refusing to go to the reservations. It's a complex history of slavery in South Carolina. It's real deep. First, remember that the Seminoles and its re-enslavement during the Seminole Wars, it was largely driven by white plantation owners and their desire to capture Seminoles, who were formerly enslaved people from South Carolina and Georgia who had fled to Florida for freedom. Now, during and after the wars, many black Seminoles were captured and returned to slavery in the South. There was also imprisonment at Fort Moultrie, which is a notable group of Seminole leaders, including Osceola, who were captured under the false flag of truce and transported to Fort Moultrie in South Carolina. They were held as prisoners of war, not sold as plantation slaves, and most were eventually sent further west to Indian Territory. And then we have indigenous slavery in the 1700s. Before the Seminole Wars, during the Yamasee War of 1715 and other early conflicts, some Native American groups, meaning the Amerindian tribes in the Southeast, were indeed sold into slavery by the British in South Carolina. However, by the time of the major 19th century, which is about the 1800s, the Seminole Wars and the U.S. policy had shifted toward forced removal to the west, which again is the Trail of Tears, rather than enslaving indigenous captures. Now, we have what we call the Mexican and the native appearance that is preserved today, and that is those of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma and some of them that are in the Seminole tribe of Florida. Many were they were successful in avoiding removal by hiding in the Everglades. Let's get us to the classification of dark-skinned indigenous people. Historical records confirm that many southeastern indigenous people, including the Seminoles, had dark complexions under the racial integrity laws and the practice of paper genocide. Many who were ethnically indigenous were categorized in colonial and state records simply as free person of color or black, effectively erasing their Seminole or Native identity in the eyes of the law. Also, the Indian slave trade in South Carolina, long before the major Seminole Wars, South Carolina was the center of a massive Indian slave trade. Tribes that lost wars to the British or were captured by other groups at the behest of colonial powers were sold into slavery on rice and indigo plantations. Also, Spanish and Seminole captives, while Spain and the Seminoles were often allies against the British, there were instances where the Spanish captured and sold indigenous rebels to maintain order. Furthermore, during the First Seminole War, U.S. forces and slave catchers specifically targeted dark-skinned Seminoles, claiming they were runaway slaves, regardless of their actual ancestry, in order to sell them to plantations in the Deep South, including South Carolina. The Spanish Seminole identity, based upon recent research into the Spanish Seminoles, highlights a group of indigenous people who integrated with Spanish Latinos fishing communities. When these groups were captured during U.S. expansion, they were often sold into the labor market, where their indigenous identity was stripped away in favor of a slave label. Now, the outcome of this process is that many modern-day families in South Carolina and Georgia who are traditionally labeled as African American are in fact descendants of these indigenous Seminole groups who were illegally or forcibly enslaved. Let's get into the dark skin. Historically, I might add, the dark-skinned indigenous people were captured as prisoners of war during resistance to colonization and again sold into slavery. There is a history, and our history and the Amerindian history and the indigenous Amerindians of North America, Central America, South America predates African slave narrative of today. Now, there are specific Seminoles that emerged in the 1700s, which would be the ancestral tribes that formed them, such as the Apalachee, the Timucua, and early Muscogee groups, which were all victims of this system long before the 19th century Seminole Wars. Now, indigenous slavery as prisoners of war, which is during the early Spanish and British periods, indigenous resistance was met with mass capture. Those who lost these wars were labeled prisoners of war and sold to plantations in South Carolina. By 1708, approximately 1/4 of all enslaved people in South Carolina were indigenous. The dark-skin reality of this is many of these tribes had naturally dark complexions, and because they were forced into the same plantation system as African captives, they were often misidentified or reclassified as black or Negro in census and property records. This served the colonial interest of erasing their tribal identity and claims to the land. Now, the pre-American conflict, which was centuries before the United States was founded, the Spanish in Florida and the British in Carolina engaged in a brutal trade where they used rival tribes to capture prisoners for export to the West Indies and other colonies. The Spanish connection is the Spanish presence in Florida starting in the year 1513, which involved numerous conflicts with local tribes who resisted their missions. Captives from these wars were frequently moved through the Spanish Caribbean and often ended up in the British slave markets of Charleston. Now, the modern result is that many descendants of these indigenous prisoners of war are currently classified as African American. despite their lineage tracing back to the original dark-skinned inhabitants of the Southeast who were enslaved for resisting the Spanish and British. Take that DNA test, flip that 80% African upside down and 20% other, and you have the direct opposite. Why would they give you the land back and deem you an indigenous Amerindian? Also, if you focus on the early colonial census codes, which was black, white, and mulatto, that will be an eye-opener as well. So when you look over the censuses, you'll see that these markings were changed. Let's get into these acts of, or should we say laws, and that will help you understand how indigenous prisoners of war, specifically those from dark-skinned tribes, were systematically reclassified and absorbed into the plantation slave system. Now you can look at the following, and I'm going to point out the colonial laws and the census practices, beginning with the South Carolina Negro Act of 1740. And this foundational law, it explicitly grouped indigenous people with Africans to ensure they remained enslaved. Now, Section 1 of that declaration states, the act that all Negroes and Indians and all their issue and offspring shall be, and they are hereby declared to be, and remain hereafter absolute slaves. Then you have the presumption of slavery. It mandated that it shall be always presumed that every Negro, Indian, mulatto, and mestizo is a slave. But then there's the burden of proof. While there's an exception was made for Indians in amity, which means allied tribes or friendly Indian, any dark-skinned indigenous person captured in war or not beginning or belonging to an allied group was legally presumed to be a slave unless they could prove otherwise, a nearly impossible task for a prisoner of war. You have the legal reclassification as mestizos and mulattoes, which is the colonial records often used with these terms on those documents. They help to strip away tribal identity. For instance, the mestizos label in South Carolina, which is the term mestizos for mestizos, was legally defined as the offspring of a Negro and an Indian. Now, over time, these individuals were subjected to the same disabilities and restrictions as free or enslaved Africans, eventually causing their indigenous ancestry to be ignored in official rallies. Then you have the visual classification. According to the Negro Law of South Carolina, color was considered prima facie evidence of slave status. If an indigenous person had dark skin, they were categorized as Negro or mulatto by census takers and slave owners who did not distinguish between different dark-skinned ethnic groups. Then we have the census paper genocide. Federal and state census records were a primary tool for erasing indigenous identity. The 1850 and 1860 instructions, before 1860, there was no Indian category on the general U.S. Census. Indigenous people living among the general population were forced into three categories. They are white, black, or mulatto. Indians were not taxed. The government only counted Indians if they were on specific reservations. Those who had been enslaved or were living in communities like the descendants of Seminole prisoners were labeled as free persons of color, FPC, or simply black. Then we had the racial integrity laws. While most famous in Virginia, Racial Integrity Act of 1924, similar to one-drop rule, their policies across the South reclassify anyone with ascertainable Negro blood, which often just meant dark skin, as colored. Legally, eliminating the existence of indigenous tribes in those states. Then we have the loss of tribal amity. Tribes that resisted colonization were removed from the status of Indians in amity, friendly Indians. Once a tribe like the Seminole or their ancestors was declared an enemy or a prisoner of war, they lost their legal protections as indigenous people and were funneled into the Indian slave trade, where they were sold as generic slaves alongside Africans.
Let's get into the list of specific surnames commonly found in the South Carolina archives that were associated with these free Indian legal battles. In the South Carolina archives and court records, certain surnames appear repeatedly in freedom suits or tax exemption cases. These families fought to prove they were Indians in amity or descendants of free indigenous women to avoid being reclassified as Negroes or mulattoes. Keep in mind that while some names are English, taken from traders or guardians, the bloodlines were often traced back to the Apalachee, the Yamasee, or Cherokee people who were enslaved in the early 1700s. The common surnames in indigenous legal records are the Matthews, with one or two T's. One of the most famous lineages in Charleston in 1819, John Matthews and his family successfully sued the state to be recognized as free Indians, exempting them from the Negro tax. The next surname is Gibson, closely tied to the Gauri and Melungeon groups. The Gibson family frequently appeared in court records throughout the Carolinas and Virginia, proving their descent from free indigenous women like Jane Gibson. Horry or Heg. These names appear in the 1740 census records of Indian captives where individuals petitioned the courts claiming they were free Indians from the Florida missions, like the Apalachee, who were illegally captured by British raiders. Oxidine or Chavis, primarily associated with the Lumbee and other southeastern tribes. These families often migrated between the South Carolina border and North Carolina, maintaining their indigenous status despite census takers attempting to label them as free persons of color. The surname Bunch or Bass. These surnames are frequently found in multiracial or mestizo communities in the Low Country. Court records show them resisting reclassification and insisting on their indigenous lineage to protect their property rights. Lastly, within this podcast, the Scott surname. Several families with the surname Scott in the Santee and PD River regions have records indicating they were descendants of indigenous prisoners who remained in the area after the Yamasee and Seminole conflicts. How can you verify or where to verify these names? To find your own connections, you should look for the free person of color on tax rolls at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. Look for the remarks column. Often, a clerk will write Indian or mestizo next to a name, even if the main category was checked as black. Let me share with you a member of the Seminole tribe who used his lighter skin and the military to be reclassified as white. It not only worked for himself, it also worked for his wife and his daughter. His name is Juan Barra, a member of the Seminole community born in Mexico around 1853. He possessed a lighter complexion that, combined with his service in the U.S. Army Indian Scouts at Fort Clark, Texas, allowed him to be reclassified or classified as white on the 1880 U.S. Census. This reclassification also applied to his wife and daughter in official records. Now, you want more information regarding Juan Barra, visit the Seminole Cemetery Association at the Seminole Cemetery Association.com. Here is a list of a few scholars and their institutions that specialize in the intersection of indigenous slavery and colonial law. Now, the following experts and archives provide the hard proof needed to validate the history of the dark-skinned tribes reclassified as slaves. Now, the first author is Dr. Alan Galley, author of The Indian Slave Trade, The Rise of the English Empire in the American South. He is the leading authority on how the early Carolina economy was built on the capture and sale of indigenous prisoners of war. Next is Dr. Evan Newell, a historian at the Native American Studies Center of USC Lancaster, who specializes in the history of the Native South and the impact of colonization on tribal identities. Next is Dr. Angela Walton Waji, author of Black Indian Genealogy Research. She is an expert on tracing the specific lineages of families who were reclassified as Black or mulatto, but possess deep indigenous roots. Lastly, according to this episode, Dr. Cal Mays, a scholar at UCLA focusing on Afro-Indigenous history and how the erasure of Native identity serves the creation of wealth and property in the U.S. I also have some essential archives and resource centers. The first is Native American South Carolina Archive, which is NASCA, a joint project of the University of South Carolina that preserves documents specifically related to the indigenous nations of the region and their interactions with colonial powers. Next, South Carolina Department of Archives and History, which is the SCDAH. This is the primary repository for public records, text rolls, and court proceedings where reclassification laws were enforced. The Southern Historical Collection, which is the UNC Chapel Hill, houses the Southern Life of Slavery and the Civil War database, which contains plantation journals and legal papers documenting the lived experience of those the system attempted to erase. Native Bound Unbound, a digital initiative dedicated to recovering every documented instance of indigenous slavery across the Americas, helping to connect descendants with their original tribal stories. Also recommended reading for show research is the book of Colonial Complex, Southern Carolina's Frontiers in the Era of the Yamasee War by Dr. Stephen Otis. Next, to research its Indians of the South Carolina Low Country, dated 1562 through 1751, written by Jean Waddell. Another book is The African Creek Nation, Black Seminoles, Ethnic Identity and the American South by author Gregory Smithers. Nations who resisted Spanish missions and British expansions. When they lost those early wars, they weren't sent to reservations. They were sold to plantations. But here is where the colonial lie kicks in. To make the system easier to manage, the colonial government passed laws like the South Carolina Negro Act of 1740. This law legally declared that all Indians captured in war were to be treated exactly like Negroes. If you had dark skin and you were in a field, the census taker didn't care about your tribal lineage. They wrote down black or mulatto. This was a deliberate legal tactic to ensure that your descendants could never claim their ancestral lands. You weren't an indigenous prisoner of war anymore. On paper, you were just a slave. This is how thousands of Seminole and other tribes, no matter the band, the clan, the tribal names, the nations, they were your kinfolks, your ancestors, and finally you. You all became African American with the stroke of a pen. We've spent today pulling back the curtain on a crime that wasn't just committed with chains and whips, but with pens and ledgers. The paper genocide was a calculated strike against the memory of a people. By reclassifying Seminole warriors and Apalachee prisoners of war as Negro or mulatto, the colonial system didn't just steal labor, it tried to steal the future. It tried to ensure that you would never look at the red clay of the Southeast and know that your grandparents or your ancestors' blood is what made it that color. But as we've seen in the court cases of Matthews, the Gibsons, and the Horeys, the truth has a way of surviving the fire. If you've always felt a pull toward this land that the history books couldn't explain, it's time to stop accepting the labels handed down by the people who enslaved your ancestors. History is written by the victors, but the legacy is carried by the survivors. You are the evidence of a war they couldn't win.
Welcome to my ancestors' voices, such an alignment. Welcome to my podcast with your host Lenora, better known as my history verified.